Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So we can see your screen again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
For those of you who've just joined, we're going to start about 3 or 4 minutes. So.
So that's why you have it late, because you have people from all over the world, right? And this is, I guess, the time when most people can be present.
Yeah, I think so. The organizers, I believe, are split between Turkey and the US.
Mm.
Okay. It's 1:05, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, I'd like to welcome everybody to the 5th installment of the 2nd year of our seminary series with Paul in Ecology. Today, we're excited to host Maria Kaika, whom I will introduce in a little bit. But first, let me briefly introduce Paul in Ecology to those who are encountering it for the first time. Paul in Ecology is a collective set out with a Marxist perspective to contribute to the development of Marxist ecological awareness, both in the ecological movement and in the socialist movement. Paul in Ecology aims to promote international Marxist ecological literature and to develop partnerships with movements in other countries. In line with the needs of the struggle, it aims to develop new organizations and platforms and to create an ecological movement in which rural and urban toilers and oppressed, and especially women and young people, become subjects and leaders. As Pollen Ecology, we invite everyone to join our collective who considers that the ecological struggle should be part of the struggle for social liberation against capitalism, and that it should be organized in a way that will spread to all of it, and who want to be involved in the development and implementation of a new program and strategy in this direction. Today's speaker, Maria Kaika, is professor in urban, regional, and environmental planning at the University of Amsterdam's Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. She promotes interdisciplinary research and teaching with particular focus on establishing a dialogue between the urban political ecology framework of analysis and planning practices and institutions. She draws particular attention to the processes through which ecological imaginaries and ideas can become planning practices that produce real socio-environmental change. She also focuses on key urban socio-environmental challenges that arise from the global economic crisis, notably the increasing exposure of livelihoods, environments, and urban futures to the fluctuations of global financial markets, which poses an imminent social risk and a challenge to urban planning and urban development practices. She is the author of numerous academic articles and essays, as well as a book titled City of Flows, Modernity, Nature, and the City. And she is also a co-editor of Turning Up the Heat, Urban Political Ecology for a Climate Emergency, published this year. Lastly, I would like to thank our interpreter, Eren Buralelar, for his great work in making this event possible in the dual language format that it has. Maria, many thanks for being here with us today, and I'll pass the mic on to you.
Thank you so much, Kenyon. Thank you so much, the collective, for the invitation and for making me aware, and from now on was joining your efforts and hopefully joining forces. Today I'm invited and I will talk about this new book that just came out, Turning Up the Heat, Urban Political Ecology for a Climate Emergency. And it's co-edited by myself, Roger Kyle, Tate Bandler, and Yanis Zaninis. The seed for this book was sown in 2020 during a workshop we held in Amsterdam. And there it became clear to us that urban political ecology, to which I will refer as UPE, is in a rather unique position to address many urgent political questions around urbanization and climate change. So we decided, let me see if I can, yeah. You see my slide change, okay? So we decided to put together this book to showcase how the epistemologies, ontologies, and methodologies of UPE can address the systemic disaster that we call climate change. So this volume brings together three intellectual generations of scholars, and their common link is that we all focus on the link between theory, empirical knowledge, and politics. The title itself, Turning Up the Heat, is a metaphor for a world that remains apathetic and depoliticized under the threat of climate emergency. But it is also a metaphor for the responsibility of us, of scholars, activists, students, citizens, to act upon what is happening, to push the boundaries of both knowledge and action forward. Now, many of urban political ecologies, UPE's ideas and concepts are common knowledge to some scholars, but because I understand this is a broader audience, let me give you a bit of a background and archaeology, if you wish, of UPE. It is a field that emerged in the late 80s and 90s with foundational texts by Neil Smith, William Cronon, Mike Davis, Eric Swingedow, Matthew Gandhi, Jean Desford, Roger Kyle, Paul Robbins, Nick Heinen, and myself, amongst others. These texts made an intervention to the fields of both urban studies and political ecology. Ontologically, UP unsettled the traditional understanding of cities as distinct entities, separate from their outside, from nature or from the periphery or from the region. The first claim UP made is that there is nothing unnatural about what we call cities. Everything we see around us in cities, bricks, steel, concrete, asphalt, are metabolized and engineered flows of natural resources put together through human labor, energy, capital investment, and technology, and which are governed by power relations. The second claim UP put forward is there is, by equal terms, there's nothing natural about a forest or a park. They're also the outcome of historical layers of metabolic flows between geological processes, human and non-human labor, capital investment, and technology. So UP claimed that there is no city as such, there is no nature as such, there is a perpetual process which I called the urbanization of nature. Most of UP's foundational concepts are now common knowledge, as I said, but let me stay with these new ontologies of nature. So in close discussion with Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour, UP developed new ontological understandings of nature and the city as hybrids, as cyborgs, neither purely human-made nor purely natural, as socio-environmental and socio-technological constructs ridden by power relations. This ontological shift made an epistemological intervention to both urban studies and political ecology. For urban studies, UP disrupted the canon, what used to be the canon of urban studies, that conceptualized cities as bounded and purely social spaces, separated from the outside, but also from the non-human world. And with respect to political ecology, urban political ecology are urged to focus not only on the extractivist politics in the global south or on the productive and extractivist landscapes of the global north, what political ecology was doing and still does very well, but urban political ecology urged to focus on the dialectic between an increasingly urbanized and luxurious lifestyles and the destruction of environments and livelihoods in the global south and the global north. So UP examines how the imperial mode of living, as Brandon Winson called it, in core urban centers is made possible only because it is possible to extract unlimited and underpaid power, energy, land, and natural resources and sinks at the global scale. Core cities can afford to become smarter and cleaner only because they can dump their externalities elsewhere. In short, our increased sustainability, mainly in the global north, and smartness is someone else's socio-environmental disaster. In short, UP's epistemology examines climate change not as a kind of collateral damage, but as a very modus operandi of capitalist urbanization. And the epistemological and ontological shift that UP claimed went hand in glove with four key methodological interventions. The first one is a call to analyze neither city nor nature as such, but as I said before, the urbanization of nature as a set of metabolic flows, socio-environmental processes, and power relations that transform and hybridize environments, people, landscapes, and more than human species. What does all this jargon mean in terms of our research practice and our politics? It means that to understand urbanization, we really need to look outside and underneath cities. We need to examine all those dams, tunnels, reservoirs, and infrastructure that disrupt geological and biophysical processes in order to serve cities, in order to convey, to bring water, bring out sewage, bring energy, food, and serve the needs of urbanization. We need to examine the capital, labor, and technology input that make these flows possible. But these engineered metabolic flows remain hidden, remain underneath and outside cities and outside the cognitive map of urban dwellers. So our first task is to make these invisible flows visible. And this invisible labor involved in making water, sewage, food, energy come in and out of city, make this labor and the social power relations involved in the production, reproduction of that labor visible. The second methodological intervention is a call to examine the urbanization of nature, not only as a metabolic process, but also as a violent process of creative destruction driven by conflict and power relations. And I'm sure this group knows this very well. So, but doing this demands expanding our analysis beyond a quantitative mapping exercise of the metabolic circuit of matter and materials that flow in and out of cities. This is the kind of work that urban metabolism and urban ecology scholars are doing quite effectively. So urban political ecology demands focusing on a dual metabolic circuit. On one hand, of cycles of economic investment and crisis, and on the other hand, of cycles of socio-ecological transformation and destruction. It is this dialectic relationship between these two circuits that lies at the heart of urbanization and which drives climate change. For example, in the prologue for our book, the now late Mike Davis points at the link between speculative urbanization and the fires that burn each year from Greenland to Hawaii and from Australia to Greece and Spain, have been burning this summer as well with horrific effects. These fire ecologies, Mike Davis argues, are fed by, but also feed into profit-driven urbanization practices. Building where there should be no building overrides local ecologies and Holocene adaptations and pushes native ecosystems past their survival tipping points. This invariably happens with public blessings and even subsidies. So to understand the reasons why fierce fires burn entire landscapes year after year, we need to understand the dialectic within the dual metabolic circuit of economic investment and socio-ecological transformation. The third methodological intervention UPE made is the persistence to historicize this dual circuit, to analyze, so it's a historical materialist perspective on climate change. To historicize this dual circuit, to analyze how and why these flows, metabolic flows, are embedded within deeply historical, political, social, and economic frameworks. Again, why does this matter in our research, but also in our politics? Take, for example, Amsterdam's canals houses. I live in Amsterdam now. That's what I see when I walk out. Under an urban political ecology framework, I try to explain not only how and why each multi-million real estate transaction over one of these houses exacerbates the housing crisis and increases marginalization. This is what housing scholars do, and is very important. Outrageous speculative practices over real estate in Amsterdam and everywhere else are at the heart of housing marginalization and deprivation. But under an urban political ecology framework, I look at this process, I look further in this process. I also try to explain how each of these housing transactions exacerbate environmental destruction. And to do this is not enough to examine aggregate real estate pricing data and global investment flows. To see how real estate speculation links to environmental destruction, I examine canal houses as sponges that have absorbed century upon century, layer upon layer, the profit that had been extracted from exploited natural resources, but also exploited bodies of men and women, not only in Amsterdam locally, but also in Suriname, Ghana, India, Angola, Senegal, South Africa, Indonesia, in ports, mines, oil rigs, breweries, cigarette and biscuit factories, windmills, tulip plantations around the world. The profit from all this, the extraction of profit from all this exploitation of nature and labor, human and more than human labor and sweat, ended up being a pile of bricks in the city we now call Amsterdam. And this is a process that didn't just happen in the past and stopped. Each time a new real estate transaction takes place in Amsterdam, fresh amounts of profit extracted from new living labor and resources across the world will again sink into that particular pile of bricks that is called an Amsterdam Canal House. So this is just to exemplify how this methodology differs from, say, a housing studies understanding of real estate speculation. And the fourth methodological intervention that UP makes is the claim to a type of scholarship that is neither conceived nor practiced as an insular academic exercise. UP is interested not only into identifying problems, but also exploring alternative pathways to urbanization. Methodologically, this means always putting forward as key question who wins and who loses out of any socio-environmental intervention. So this is my wrapping up, the end of my archaeological bit on UP's intellectual history. Today, UP, of course, spans over 3 decades of cross-fertilization and self-criticism. But also today, the hybrid ontologies that UP suggested are more relevant than ever before. The dynamics of capitalist growth produce even more violent and more feral forms of extended urbanization that blur further the boundaries between the inside and the outside and lead to new waves of destruction and inequality. As I noticed before, the fires and floods that devastate every year many locations across the world bring into sharp relief the consequences of extended urbanization in places where there shouldn't be any urbanization. And they point at capitalist urbanization as the heart of climate emergency. So in this book, we identify 4 key debates in urban political ecology that have the potential to make not only a theoretical contribution, but also a political intervention to the current environmental emergency. The first debate discusses these new ontologies and epistemologies of urbanization. These new forms of urbanization that emerged over the last decades that disrupt the traditional dynamic between city and the outside core periphery. So these new forms of urbanization, corridor urbanization, extensive suburbanization, expansive employment zones, office cities, aerotropolises, extended infrastructural zones, massive production sites, logistics cities, deforested monocultural landscapes and desacotas. These are no longer some kind of hinterland that serves a certain core. They are forms of urbanization that create new layered dynamics of growth and decline, densification, de-densification, and they promote new forms of inequality, marginalization and exclusion, and of course, environmental hazard. Trying to deal with this complexity, UP's ontologies expanded and hybridized. Planetary urbanization remained at the core of UP's epistemology, but received criticism as an approach that is not situated enough to deal with the new ontological complexities of urbanization. So a debate opened within UP and the productive dialogue with science technology studies and actor network theory. So in the book, we propose the concept of extended urbanization as a field unifying concept that can push us to theorize the urban and the environment not from the core outside, but from the margins in, will skip in attention to the core. And second, it can help us expand our understanding of marginality beyond the traditional notions, actors, and spaces. And why this matters politically? I claim this is not an academic, it might sound very intellectualized and academic, but it matters politically. Why? I'll give you an example. When Berger depicted the US suburban fringe as no man's land in 2017, this is not simply an academic representation. Accepting US suburbia as no man's land means ignoring millennia of metabolic flows between humans and non-humans that produce these landscapes. But also it means ignoring generations of power struggles over land between indigenous and settlers. It means neglecting the history of power dynamics between state planning and private property regimes that normalize land grabbing and marginalization. There is no such thing as no man's land. All the authors in our book write from this standpoint. For example, Roberto Luis Montemor and Esther Limonad research and speak from spaces that have been perceived as no man's land in the past, from spaces and economies that survived or emerged outside Brazil's core colonial industrial urbanization. And they find in these neglected spaces, not only alternative economies, but also the potential to produce alternative socio-environmental futures for the core. And I would be really keen during the discussion to hear reflections from the places where you are at or you research with respect to this understanding of places beyond the core as central for what happens in the core. The second debate that the book focuses on brings to the fore the call for a situated urban political ecology. This comes from scholars working on and from the Global South and from post-colonial feminist and intersectional scholars who see the possibility for a broader range of urban experiences to inform theory and on how urban environments are shaped, politicized, and contested. This Southern urbanism and situated UPE in the book refers not only to the different forms, modes, and power relations around urbanizing nature, it also refers to the politics of research and the politics of theorization. It's a call to decenter the position from which theory itself is produced and developed. For example, Wangui Kimari discusses how Nairobi's colonial past shapes not only present urbanization practices, but also the way people define themselves and others as political subjects. In Nairobi, European settlers chose the elevated, mosquito-free areas for their habitation, and they left the low-lying floodplains to the natives. Today, these racialized geographies of the past become the foundational map on which capital draws new exploitative practices. The racialized geographies of the past are still today's the canvas on which people structure and portray themselves in the political sphere and as political subjects. Nikki Luke and Nick Heinen in this book also discuss the emancipatory potential of linking demands for decarbonizing the electrical grid in New Orleans to demands for energy reparation related to the US Black radical tradition. The third debate the book examines is the conceptual methodological challenges and its political implications of bringing the more than human life world into the UPE agenda. So the book calls to cross-fertilize further with science and technology studies, with ecology science, with geology, with landscape ecology, with the work of Tsing and De La Bella Casa to cross further disciplinary boundaries. For example, in their chapter, Kyle, Ali, and Treffers add infectious disease and zoonosis to UPE's analysis of the metabolic explanations that include the more than human. They examine the SARS, the Ebola, and the COVID outbreaks and argue that a spatialized political ecology of infectious disease can help mitigate the impact of outbreaks in a continuously urbanized world. And the fourth and final debate of the book addresses the important political conundrum. The following: while scholars move beyond privileging cities as objects of inquiry, policymakers, by contrast, increasingly make the city the preferred site for policy intervention. Cities are now expected to save the planet. International organizations fund urban labs to promote techno-managerial solutions through circular economies, smart cities, etc. We argue that these technocratic urban risk management practices can link to what Swingedal calls a depoliticization of key socio-environmental issues. But the chapters in this book also show that the same techno-managerial solutions can become generative of new forms of politics. For example, Irina Velicu explains how the techno-managerial policy that promoted a one-way future for Romania as an urban industrial state facilitated land grabbing and dispossession of the country's peasant population. But at the same time, this practice generated a new political consciousness, a growing number of people, including young people who proclaimed themselves to be the new peasants of the country, and formed the Euro-Ruralis, a movement that challenges land grabbing and industrial scale food production. So, I gave an overview of the four key debates in the book and some highlights of some of the chapters. What now? How do we go forward? How do we take UP and environmental politics forward? The book is to move the politics of academia and political life beyond apocalyptic scenarios. Pointing at global capitalism as the source of all crises, however, is not enough. My own research agenda from this point onwards, focuses at the need to build alternative practices and new imaginaries that will take us beyond these apocalyptic scenarios. But at the moment, we don't have a coherent alternative, but we do have on-the-ground practices and ideas suggesting alternative ways forwards. Most of these are very localized and take their cue from the Latin American discourses on buen vivir. They suggest replacing the imperial mode of living with a solidarity mode of living, a solidarity not only for people in the global south, but also for those in the global north whose life are far from luxurious. And solidarity also for the biophysical world, for species more than humans. This demand for a solidary mode of living questions the imperative for growth, and in this respect is very closely aligned with debates in favor of degrowth. But the problem is that we are currently in a complete political stalemate when it comes to turning these progressive localized practices and imaginaries into a broader programmatic global agenda that can challenge growth, can challenge capitalism, and possibly address climate change. This stalemate does not only come from the evil doings of capitalism, and this is what's so interesting for us. This stalemate comes from an important disagreement right inside the realm of progressive politics. It is a disagreement over the following dilemma. A, should we save the planet by pulling the brakes on capitalist growth altogether, which is what degrowth argues, or should we maintain a level of growth that can secure jobs and improve livelihoods in the global south and the north, which is what socialist modernizers would argue. So the progressive academia and progressive politics are into this stalemate at this moment. But I suggest this can be seen as a false dilemma, the one that we urgently need to debunk if we are to move forward. I suggest 4 directions that can help us go beyond this dilemma and move towards a progressive politics of solidary growth. The first suggestion is to take seriously Matthew Huber's depiction of climate change as class war. So far, UP has not been that good in incorporating work and labor into our analysis of socio-environmental metabolism. To do this, we need to take seriously Stefania Barca's definition of work as a gendered and racialized mediator of socio-environmental metabolism and work from there. Why do I argue this is the most important task? Because if we accept that the expansion of capitalism is dependent on unequal global ecological exchanges, then we need to take seriously also into consideration that these global unequal exchanges are not only unequal transfers of matter, they are also matter, I mean land, energy, water, sun, etc. They are also unequal transfers of labor, of human and animal labor embodied in food and materials we consume, from beans and berries to cars and phones to construction materials. There are also unequal exchanges of reproductive labor that supports the production process. These unequal transfers of productive and reproductive labor need to be calculated into the global solidary exchanges that we want to achieve. This work has just started. I already mentioned Barca, Huber. There's recent work by Allison, Mieville, Seymour, and Warren. And hopefully many more emerging and being elaborated as we speak. The second thing I suggest to do to help us debunk this false dilemma of saving the planet versus increasing well-being is to focus on the production side of things. I've already mentioned it. All current operational alternatives to urbanization are consumption level solutions, from recycling to circular economies to smart economies. So if we want to construct solidary global exchanges, we need to focus on the production level. We need to move towards what Herman calls the use value society, an economy that destroys the things that destroy the planet. Holgis and Valenius call for the destruction of the infrastructures of fossil capital, coal plants, oil platforms, etc. I suggest we should go further than that. We should also demand, perhaps predominantly, the destruction of the infrastructures of financial capital, because this is the financial capital. It invests and thrives on the destruction of livelihoods and environments across the globe through debt and finance-driven speculative growth practices, from tar sand oil extraction to explanatory urbanization. The third suggestion I make is to start systematically reimagining and prefiguring what new types of specialities, what new forms of urbanization does this new use value economy and solidary mode of living demand. These new specialities will have to be very different to the specialities demanded, say, by the 19th century workers revolting, or by the 1960s urban social movements, the kind of things they demanded. 19th century workers' uprisings demanded demolition, to tear up slums, create better housing, sanitary conditions. The 1960s also partly demanded demolition of the infrastructures that were wrong. Our demands, I argue, should not be for demolition, but for a kind of repair urbanity. A solidary repair urbanity that starts with prefiguring new use values for what Sieverts calls the in-between city. This is not a utopian call. It is already happening. And I'll give you some examples. The first is a very banal example of what can happen if we claim the often 50% of urban space that is taken over by traffic. And this is quite banal. But also, example two, what can happen if we claim we don't have enough housing, certainly in many places of the global north and certainly in many places of the global south. So imagine if we were to embrace the way refugees at this moment re-inhabit dilapidated urban infrastructures in the global north, across Europe, and create new forms of co-housing, coexisting, and commoning. This is what refugees did in Istanbul. Some of you are familiar with these images, I'm sure. And in Athens and Belgrade, this is the three cities that we examined in a project with Harala Mustadaroğlu. They reclaimed all hotels, train barracks, and gave new life to these dilapidated urban spaces. But all of these common housing practices that you see here are already demolished or evicted in the name of urban speculative renewal. Another example I'm going to give you, these new imaginaries and how we can embrace them, is what infrastructure activism can do with these used urban spaces. This is an unbuilt lot in Ljubljana that the Crater Collective turned into a living and encountering space for human and more than humans, and they hold on to it at the moment. And this is what we have been doing in the multi-species urbanism project in Amsterdam, together with soil artist Deborah Solomon. Here, Deborah and her collective have been working for 4 years on this iconic modernist high-rise social housing blocks in Bijlmer in Amsterdam Southeast. So together with the local inhabitants, Deborah reconfigured the management regimes of urban greens and turned them from dead splashes of green in between concrete blocks, what we see on the left here, into use value spaces that produce food for people, for insects and for birds, and spaces for meaningful encounters between humans and the biophysical world. The fourth and final suggestion, I'm coming to an end of the talk here, is that if we are serious about destroying the things that destroy the planet, and if we're serious about creating an economy of use values, we, activists, citizens, social scientists, need to engage more closely with natural scientists. We need to bring ecology. Staying with the trouble of extended urbanization as a matter of concern does not mean succumbing to the reformist, technocratic, and mechanical suggestions that claim that cities can save the world. But it does mean acknowledging what Roger Kyle argues, that the imperial mode of living has a home and climate change has an address. It is the extended urbanized world in which we live. And UP and academia as a whole, but also beyond academia, practitioners, planners, architects, activists, citizens as a whole, we all have an urgent and serious task to address these challenges and remain relevant ourselves to the politics of a heated planet without allowing technocracy to take over our politics. I'll stop sharing now. This is the end of my talk, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was a really engaging talk. I enjoyed it quite a lot. Okay, so we're going to open up the floor for some questions. Since we have 2 language channels going, if you could type your questions into the chat in whatever language, either Turkish or English, and those will be translated and given to me so that I can ask them of Maria. To start with, while those are coming in, I have a couple of questions here, and one of them relates, I think, pretty well to your last point or your last suggestion. So you talk about the need for social scientists to work more closely with natural scientists in trying to create a new way of living that is oriented on a use value economy. And so I know there's often some friction between social sciences and natural sciences. And so I was wondering if you could point to an example of a collaboration that has sort of provided global suggestions of how we can work through this crisis.
Many examples. Okay. What comes to mind first is the work of Della Bella Casa, but also Anna Tsing, The Mushroom at the End of the World, and Della Bella Casa's work on soil is quite significant. So because they speak from the perspective of a soil scientist. And the work I do with Deborah Solomon here, she speaks from the perspective of a soil artist, but also an architect. And just the shift of focus to in this case, the soil, or in other cases, the flows of water or the fish in the water and the kind of species that inhabit or not inhabit the port of Amsterdam. This is a project we're doing at the moment. We're just starting. It gives the opportunity to see how, to see a new perspective of how these global circuits and flows of capital and global circuits of urbanization and global circuits of environmental destruction work in synergy, in this case, in soil destruction. So, but you need this synergy between scientists and soil scientists or ecologists and social scientists and economists and planners, architects, in order to each one see the world in a grain of soil, literally, and in order to bring out those very complex flows. Because what we deal with is very complex, it is very important methodologically to focus literally on a grain of sand, on a drop of water, or a little thing that can tell us a lot. So this is the kind of methodological shift I suggest at this moment. And it is happening. We haven't seen a full, fully blown collaborations published already, but the first results from the literature I just quoted are quite astonishing. And what is missing, however, still is the very important question of labor and production. And it's us, social scientists and activists, who need to bring that in, because everybody tends to, it's interesting. Also psychologically, it's interesting how we always neglect or forget that the most important element of that, living labor and reproductive labor, that makes everything possible, and which creates value, of course, as we know.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, the next question, I think labor might also be sort of the answer to this next question as well. But so we see like there's a lot of talk in sort of like the discussions around climate disaster of capitalism as a system sort of visiting destruction upon the environment. But at the same time, there are ways in which climate disaster and the destruction of the environment undermines capitalism's ability to generate more profit. And so I was wondering, in addition to sort of capitalism manipulating social natural dynamics, what is sort of a way in which that can be flipped, either strategically or just something that exists historically, of how different human and natural relationships and configurations can confront sort of the endless drive for accumulation?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. First of all, let me question one of the thesis you presented. We have no evidence that environmental destruction undermines capital's ability to create growth and generate profit. On the contrary, we have ample evidence for the exact opposite. So every new wave of environmental destruction boosts capitalist profiteering and increases marginalization and puts wealth into increasingly fewer and fewer human beings. This we know. This is the fact. The idea that the second contradiction of capitalism. This is what you're referring to. Actually, we don't have hard evidence that this is in fact happening. So let me just query, but even if we accept that, I think what happens at the moment is that activists, academics, and the whole of the labor force, that is all of us as producers of knowledge, of materials, we are all laborers. So all of us, by the rift that occurred between the labor movement and the environmental movement, particularly during the 80s, which is a direct result of neoliberalism, where it brought us today is a debate and a agonism between labor, reproduction, and environment. And it comes to a crunch with the environmental transition, with the energy transition question. So we have across the world labor workers opposing energy transitions in the name of retaining jobs in the fossil fuel sector. And they're right to oppose it. But it is our task and their task to show that by opposing this transition, labor is actually undermining its own existence, not the existence of capitalism. It's undermining its own value, and the devaluation of labor across the world is a fact. So again, I think bringing together environmental thinking and labor policies and practices is the most important task we have at this moment. If we want to raise awareness at the broader scale, I mean, we're preaching to the converted here. You know, we are a select group. We all think alike, more or less. We think at the same direction, at least. Yeah, our politics are looking in the same direction, more or less. But we are increasingly being marginalized, or we are already marginalized. If we engage with everyday people, of course they care about their not losing their jobs. Of course they are subject to any ideology that tells them, oh, you know, if we go into energy transitions, you're gonna be worse off. Or so it's a real task for not only for intellectual thought, but for real engagement in terms of policy practice, not only at the local level. Sorry, I'll try to make my answers short.
No, that's great. This is awesome. I love hearing the long, more exhaustive answers. Okay, so at this point we have two more questions. The first one relates to Turkey, which is relevant to a large portion here. So in turning up the heat, I believe you mentioned that Turkey is one of the leading countries in increased concrete production, which is directly linked to extended urbanization. And so considering that very recently, Turkey has had two major earthquakes that affected the lives of millions and turned cities into rubble, what do you think about rebuilding projects that follow these quote unquote natural disasters? And how would you situate those within urban political ecology?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I want to a clarification. What do I think about rebuilding projects with respect to what? So, of course, okay, so the short answer is I have no scruples at all about housing. We need to do it. We should do more of it. And if millions of people are left without homes, absolutely, I have no environmental scruples about housing people. Is that? But I'm not sure if that is the question. So, but to go beyond this, the need to rebuild, two things. The first is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why in the Turkish and all other earthquake phenomena, the disaster and the loss of life is not a direct outcome of nature's force. It's a direct outcome of speculative practices, of trying to save, developers trying to save materials, not following strict measures, of national legislation that does not cater, is not good for the geological conditions under which you build. The seismological regulations of the building code are not good enough because they favor profiteering developers. So at the heart of the loss of human life lies a series of, and history of legislation, speculation, and speculative urbanization practices. So looking forward, when we do build these new homes for millions of people, the thing to do is to take these things into account. And how do we take these things into account? I'm afraid I'm going to sound a bit centralizing here, but we do need strong regulation. We cannot leave it up to petty or big entrepreneurs and developers to go in and do it. Or if we do, we need to have a very strong hand in regulating these things. I'm not sure if that was what the question was geared at.
Yes, I think that was exactly the gist of the question.
One more thing that links to what I said is also, at the same time that millions are left without homes, we have a decaying urbanity or a lot of disuse or underuse of existing urban areas. And this in-between urbanity that I mentioned, and this repair urbanity, is something we could collectively think about and plan ahead. Again, this, I'm afraid, takes more centralized view of things and planning practices. It cannot be done with, the great disaster of neoliberal planning and urbanization was this acupuncture planning. We do this little bit here and some effects may flow over to the other end. We can't do acupuncture planning anymore. Certainly not for disaster zones like the ones in Turkey. I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, yeah, that was excellent. Thank you. Okay, so the final question that we have here, so inclusion and acknowledgement of the non-human world is becoming a more relevant subject as ecological destruction accelerates, especially in the context of urbanity. What types of relationships can be imagined between humans and non-human animals? And to what extent can the exploitative nature of animal use by humans be transformed in this new spatial formation?
Can you repeat the last bit, please? To what extent?
To what extent can the exploitative nature of animal use by humans be transformed in this new spatial formation of urbanity?
Yeah. I'll bring you two examples. In the work, this multi-species urbanism work we do with Deborah Solomon in Amsterdam, is a good case in point. So the drive for this work was the local community. It's a kind of, it's a low-income community. It's disused spaces. There were complaints by some, but not all residents about youth hangout and da-da-da-da. The city council didn't like it, da-da-da, for reasons that had to do with social interaction. Now, this, however, became an opportunity to transform the human and more than human interaction. So what happened there is by creating a productive, these green lawns are classic modernist designs. Yeah, the green lawns are the left between of the big tower blocks that modernism built. So these in-between spaces, the lawns, were recreational landscapes. Yeah, so bringing in production from humans, trying to transform those spaces from recreational, unproductive landscapes into productive landscapes that produce food, is suddenly And this is where what I mean by it's important to involve scientists. To do that, you really need to engage with soil science. You cannot transform alone into a meadow and a food-producing landscape unless you first start with the micro. You have to change the whole ecology of the microorganisms in the soil. And that's what Deborah and the Urbania Hove Collective did. That's where they started, from the soil, from the microorganisms. So in order, this kind of synergy between the human and more than human in producing a use value economy is what I'm talking about. I don't know if that is that example demonstrates better. So, and by producing first the synergy with the microorganisms in the soil, and then the first meadow species and flowers start appearing. And then you have another layer of species appearing, the flowers, the plants. And then these attract yet another layer of species, which are bees, et cetera, that pollinate. And then the humans get food out of these. And so you create an entirely new metabolic flow between different human and non-human species. But the key here is the aim for a use value, for producing use value economies. So I think this synergy, use value production, focus on use value. If we did that, I think we don't even have to take placards and say, more than human, flag it up. We don't need to flag it up. If we start doing it, we producing a use value economy, focus on production, we will have to do it by default. We don't need to intellectualize it even. It's there, it's in the making.
Like it would be such a fundamental transformation of the relationships that, okay. That's awesome. Thank you so much. I think those are the questions that we had come through. So now I want to say on behalf of Pollen Ecology, thank you so much, Maria, for coming. I think we all really enjoyed this talk, and I know I certainly did. So yeah, we really appreciate you coming out.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the wonderful questions and that push me to think, and we think together. And please do get in touch with me if you have cases from your own experience, places or research case studies, etc., that you found that it links somehow to what I was talking about. Please don't hesitate to get in touch and discuss this. And hopefully I will see you in further venues and events, and hopefully live at some point.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this talk I think is currently being live broadcast. Additionally, a video of it will appear on YouTube. And so for everyone who is new to Pollen Ecology, you can find out more information on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And we look forward to seeing everybody at future events. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
İyiyim, teşekkürler.